Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I am painfully aware I'm the only thing standing between you and free drinks, so I'll try and not delay you too much. So my name is Rory Holmes. I work for a startup, or scale-up, perhaps you'd say now, called ClearSpace. Our mission is to bring servicing infrastructure to space. And the question I want to pose to you today is, does bringing servicing to space change everything? So some context, building upon the great talks we've had so far this afternoon. There are over $300 billion worth of satellites in orbit today, and there is no servicing infrastructure to support them. These satellites underpin many aspects of our daily life, whether it's the GPS satellites that guided you here, the Earth observation satellites that feed our weather forecasts, our climate change models, the broadcast satellites that bring Sky TV to our houses, or the telecommunication satellites that bring internet and connectivity to the hard-to-reach places. We really rely on space and satellites. But for all these satellites, we have no way of interacting with them physically once we've launched them. We set them off into space. We've got no way of repairing them when they fail, no way of refueling them when they run out of gas, no way of upgrading them when newer technology becomes available. I think our attitude in the space industry is nicely summarized in one quote: failure is not an option. When we launch a satellite, it has to work. It has to work for its full lifetime, and it has to take all the consumables, the fuel it needs at the very beginning to do that. It's kind of a strange constraint, right? There aren't many other industries here on the ground where you have such a constraint. So I thought we could do a quick thought experiment together. We could consider what this constraint would do to a terrestrial industry. I should probably caveat this with I'm a space person. I've only ever done space. I know nothing of the real world outside of space, so I'm perhaps not the best person to do this, but I will take an attempt. So imagine we have to make a car. We have to make a car that will survive for its full lifetime with no servicing infrastructure to support it. We have to make a car that from the moment it leaves the showroom to the moment it drives its last kilometer in 15 years' time, that it survives by itself. No access to mechanics, no access to petrol stations to refill. What would that car look like? As I said, I'm a space person, not an automotive person, but this is what I would do. I'd think, firstly, we have a lot of potholes at the moment in the UK. I'm sure some of you are aware. We probably should prepare for some flat tires. We should add lots of wheels. We need to add enough wheels that we can accommodate 1, 2, 3, 5 flat tires and keep on rolling. We probably also need to think about the engine. We need to spend a lot of time, a lot of hours, a lot of money developing an engine that will never fail. That's not only the design side of it, it's the testing, the validation. We need to be absolutely confident that this engine will last 15 years by itself. And once we've done that, we should probably put another engine on top as well, just in case that first one fails. We also need to make sure that it has enough fuel to last 15 years. We can't refuel it. We can't go to the petrol station. So we probably need a really, really, really big fuel tank on top as well. Fourthly, we're going to be quite risk averse, right? We need to make sure this works. So we probably have to use technology that we've used before. Something that worked in a previous generation of our car, we'd probably embark in this version. We just know it works, right? We can't take the risk with a new cutting edge technology. So what does that mean? It means our sound system probably has to rely on cassette. We probably have to put a cassette deck in here as well. But okay, we know that works, so that's fine. So what have we learned? We've learned, firstly, I'm never going to get my dream job working in Formula One. Secondly, I can't draw any better than I could 30 years ago. But on top of that, what have we made? We've made a car that probably will last 15 years, probably. It's not very efficient. We've had to invest a lot of hours, a lot of cost in reliability and embarking redundant systems in reliability to make sure it never fails. We've not made a very good car, really. And it's going to be expensive. It's going to be out of reach of most people. It's kind of facetious to explain it like this, but this really has been the world I've seen in the last 20 years in space. How do things change when you have a servicing industry? You go from this to a normal car. The space industry is seeing a servicing infrastructure coming. Changes are coming. So let's look at a few immediate examples of how a servicing infrastructure in space can change things. Failures. Failures do happen. What happens if we have a viable repair service in space? A great example of a recent failure, or maybe great is the wrong word, an unfortunate example of a recent failure was Viasat-3 last year, a big, large, expensive telecommunication satellite, reportedly to cost $700 million. Shortly after launch, it was deploying its large retroreflector, the big antenna thing, which is used to communicate with users on the ground. That deployment failed halfway. This satellite, therefore, has only about 10% of the capability that it was originally planned for. 10% of the revenue-generating potential that it was originally planned for. There is a $700 million asset in orbit that has lost 90% of its capability, 90% of its revenue-generating potential because of a single failure. How much would this satellite operator pay for a viable repair service for that reflector? I think another immediate example of where servicing infrastructure in space can have a big impact is with refueling. So repair. Companies like ClearSpace and others are building space robotic capabilities, allowing this kind of repair to become a reality. Another example of servicing infrastructure in space is refueling. We know that many, many satellites have to be retired because they've exhausted their fuel reserves. These are satellites that are working, still doing their job, still servicing customers on the ground, still making revenue for their operators that just have to be switched off because they've run out of fuel. Imagine what happens when we can refuel these assets. And again, this is a technology that ClearSpace and other companies are developing to make sure that satellites can be refueled in orbit. Satellites can go and rendezvous with a fuel depot in orbit, dock with it, take a fresh tank of fuel, and go on to complete other missions and make more revenue and serve more people on the ground. So these are just two examples of how an in-orbit servicing infrastructure can change the space industry. But I think these are just two stepping stones to the greater prize, to the big revolution that's coming. If we return to our quote, failure is not an option. What happens if failure is an option? You can see it was bigger when I made it. It's crossed out, trust me. So in terrestrial-based industries, whether it's automotive or maritime, failure is not desired, but it can be accommodated, right? It can be remediated. What happens when the same thing happens in space? When we have viable repair services that can remediate failure. What does that mean for us? We go back to our car analogy. We probably can remove that big fuel tank. We can refuel in orbit. Our satellites can devote that cost, that mass, that volume for that big tank to hardware for their primary mission aim, for the cameras, the transponders, the sensors they need to do their real job. If there's viable repair services in orbit, we can relax our reliability requirements. We need to spend less time during the development, during the test of our satellites to make sure they're ultimately reliable. We can also remove those redundant systems that we've had to put in place. We can also get much more risk tolerant. We can embark the latest technology, the latest, greatest cutting edge technology that may not work first time, but we can intervene in orbit and we can repair. We can put perhaps that 6G enabled, internet driven, AI powered sound system on board instead of the tape deck we were originally thinking of. If we have servicing infrastructure in space, we can make better, more focused, more efficient satellites at a fraction of the cost. Bringing servicing to space changes everything. Thank you.